inside the no-return unit. The prison system's most extreme experiment. A steel door closes, not with force, but with certainty. Inside this unit, nothing dramatic happens quickly. No chaos, no shouting, no escape attempts. What happens here unfolds slowly, invisibly, inside the mind. This is a place designed for people the system believes cannot return to society, to normal prison life, sometimes even to themselves. This is the no-return unit. And once someone enters, the most dangerous part is not the cell. It's what prolonged isolation begins to do to human thought. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Across modern prison systems, there are housing units that exist beyond punishment and beyond rehabilitation. They are justified as necessary, built to contain individuals labeled uncontrollable, persistently violent, or unable to function around others. Officially, these units are described in neutral language: restrictive housing, administrative segregation, special management. But behind the terminology is a reality shaped by extreme control, minimal stimulation, and prolonged separation from human contact. This documentary does not argue innocence or guilt. It examines what happens psychologically when human beings are removed from meaningful social existence for months or years at a time. Using verified research from the National Institute of Justice, the American Psychological Association, state corrections data, and decades of prison psychology scholarship, we examine how these environments reshape behavior, identity, and perception. This is not a story about monsters. It is a study of what extreme systems do to the human mind. Entry into the no-return unit. Placement into a no-return type unit rarely follows a single incident. According to correctional policy records and NIJ analysis, most inmates assigned to long-term restrictive housing arrive there after a pattern of behavior: repeated rule violations, assaults, refusal to comply, or perceived inability to coexist safely with others. In many cases, the decision is administrative, not judicial. For the inmate, the transition is abrupt. Personal property is reduced. Movement is controlled by schedule, escort, and permission. Human interaction becomes functional rather than social. Brief commands, compliance checks, silent escorts. Psychologist Craig Haney describes this moment as a psychological severing. The individual is not only separated from others, but from the informal cues that structure reality: conversation, unpredictability, shared time. Former inmates interviewed in multiple nonfiction studies described the first weeks as disorienting rather than frightening. One federal segregation case record notes an inmate who initially welcomed isolation, believing it would bring calm. Within weeks, he reported difficulty tracking time, intrusive thoughts, and an inability to sleep without pacing. This response is consistent with research cited by the APA. When environmental stimulation drops suddenly, the brain does not rest, it searches. In the absence of external input, internal thoughts intensify. Correctional staff notice changes early. In CDCR documentation, officers report inmates speaking less, then suddenly talking to themselves. Routine behaviors, standing for count, responding to orders, become either rigidly mechanical or erratic. Importantly, these reactions are not signs of weakness. They are predictable neurological responses to reduced sensory and social input. The no-return unit does not immediately break people. It reshapes them quietly day by day, and this is only the beginning. When isolation, starts to change perception. After the initial adjustment period, something more subtle begins to occur. The brain stops reacting to isolation as a temporary condition and starts treating it as the new reality. Psychological research cited by the American Psychological Association and the National Institute of Justice shows that humans rely on continuous social feedback to regulate perception, emotion, and self-concept. In ordinary life, even brief interactions, eye contact, tone of voice, casual conversation, serve as anchors. They confirm what is real, what is appropriate, and where the self exists in relation to others. Inside long-term restrictive housing, those anchors disappear. Days become difficult to distinguish from one another. Without varied stimuli, memory stops organizing itself around events and instead blurs into repetition. In multiple nonfiction inmate interviews documented in state correctional records, individuals report being unable to recall whether something happened yesterday or weeks earlier. This is not memory loss in the traditional sense. It is memory without markers. Psychologist Craig Haney explains that prolonged isolation disrupts the brain's normal rhythm of attention and reflection. When there is nothing external to respond to, the mind turns inward, often compulsively. Thoughts loop. Small worries expand. Past conflicts replay with increasing intensity. One inmate, described in a federal segregation case study, reported spending hours reconstructing conversations from years earlier, correcting imagined mistakes, and replaying arguments with people he had not seen in a decade. Over time, these mental rehearsals became emotionally indistinguishable from real interactions. This is how isolation alters perception, not through hallucination at first, but through over-immersion in internal reality. Correctional officers notice these changes in behavior long before clinical symptoms appear. According to CDCR staff reports and similar documentation from other systems, inmates begin to respond more slowly to instructions, ask the same procedural questions repeatedly, or fixate on minor rule details with unusual intensity. The environment rewards hypervigilance. Any small deviation, missing a command, standing incorrectly for count, can result in consequences. As a result, attention narrows. The mind becomes trained to scan constantly for threat, even when nothing is happening. Over time, this heightened alertness has a cost. APA-reviewed studies indicate that sustained hypervigilance increases anxiety, irritability, and emotional volatility. In isolation units, this often appears as sudden mood shifts. Long periods of flat affect interrupted by brief episodes of anger, despair, or agitation. Importantly, these reactions occur regardless of prior mental health history. John Irwin's work on prison environments emphasizes that isolation does not merely exacerbate existing conditions. It can generate psychological distress in individuals who previously showed no clinical symptoms. One documented inmate case from a state-level restrictive housing review involved a man with no recorded mental illness prior to placement. After 8 months, he began reporting sensations of movement in the cell when nothing was moving. He knew, intellectually, that the perception was false, but the sensation persisted. This distinction matters. Isolation does not always produce psychosis in the dramatic sense. More often, it produces perceptual instability, a growing gap between what a person knows and what they feel. The mind starts to doubt itself. Sound becomes unpredictable. Ordinary noises, air vents, distant footsteps, metal doors, take on exaggerated meaning. Some inmates report becoming convinced that certain sounds signal punishment or danger, even when patterns cannot be confirmed. Without external correction, these interpretations harden. Chicago Crime Lab analyses of long-term segregation outcomes note that individuals released directly from isolation units often show impaired decision-making and heightened threat perception, even in non-threatening environments. The brain has adapted to scarcity and control and does not easily readjust. Inside the unit, the social self begins to erode. Language changes. With no conversation to practice nuance, speech becomes blunt, minimal, or oddly formal. Some inmates stop speaking altogether unless required. Others overspeak during brief interactions, attempting to compress days of unexpressed thought into seconds. Neither response is voluntary. They are adaptive strategies. Correctional staff face their own psychological strain in this environment. Officers assigned long-term to restrictive housing units report emotional distancing as a coping mechanism. According to correction psychology research cited by NIJ, staff often reduce empathy not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, to function in a setting where emotional engagement can be overwhelming. This creates a feedback loop. The inmate experiences staff as distant and mechanical. Staff experience inmates as unpredictable and withdrawn. Both sides adapt by reducing emotional investment. Over time, the unit becomes emotionally silent. And in silence, the mind fills the space. Some inmates attempt to impose structure, counting steps, creating routines, memorizing books, exercising obsessively. These behaviors are not signs of resilience alone. They are attempts to reassert control over perception. Others withdraw entirely. Haney's research notes that prolonged isolation can produce a phenomenon known as social death. Not the loss of life, but the loss of one's sense of being a participant in a shared human world. When no one responds to your thoughts, your reactions, or your presence, identity begins to dissolve. The no-return unit does not announce this moment. There is no clear line where perception changes permanently. There is only a gradual shift from reacting to the environment to being shaped by it. And once that shift occurs, returning to normal social reality becomes profoundly difficult. In the next chapter, the consequences deepen. When isolation begins to alter emotional regulation, impulse control, and the ability to trust one's own reactions. Emotional unraveling and the loss of self-regulation. By the time isolation has altered perception, another change is already underway, less visible but more dangerous. Emotional regulation begins to fail. Under normal conditions, emotions are moderated through constant feedback. People learn what is acceptable, what is excessive, and what is shared through interaction. Frustration is released through conversation. Anger is softened by perspective. Fear is corrected by reassurance. Inside the no-return unit, none of those corrective mechanisms exist. According to the American Psychological Association and National Institute of Justice findings, prolonged social deprivation disrupts the brain systems responsible for impulse control and emotional balance. The result is not continuous distress, but emotional instability. Inmates often describe feeling emotionally flat for long stretches of time, followed by sudden surges of intense feeling that seem to come from nowhere. Anger, panic, despair, and agitation can spike without clear triggers. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological response. Craig Haney's prison psychology research explains that isolation weakens the brain's capacity to regulate emotional intensity. Without practice and social exchange, the mechanisms that dampen strong emotions lose efficiency. The mind swings between numbness and overload. Correctional records document this pattern repeatedly. In one verified state-level restrictive housing review, an inmate who had gone weeks without incident suddenly reacted aggressively to a routine procedural delay, an escort arriving minutes late. The behavior appeared irrational to staff. In psychological terms, it was predictable. When emotional pressure builds with no release, even minor disruptions can trigger disproportionate reactions. This is one reason why isolation units often appear paradoxical. They're designed to control behavior, yet they frequently produce more volatility over time. The body contributes to the problem. Long-term isolation disrupts sleep cycles. Artificial lighting, limited physical exertion, and constant alertness interfere with circadian rhythm. APA-reviewed studies link sleep disruption directly to reduced emotional control, impaired judgment, and increased irritability. Inmate accounts from nonfiction documentation frequently mention insomnia, fragmented sleep, or sleeping at irregular hours. Over time, exhaustion compounds emotional instability. The sense of self, also begins to weaken. John Irwin's work on prison identity highlights that identity is not fixed. It is reinforced through recognition. When no one engages with your thoughts, humor, or personality, those traits atrophy. Individuals begin to experience themselves as less complex, less real. Some inmates describe feeling as though they are fading or becoming interchangeable with the environment. Their names are rarely spoken. Their individuality has little relevance to daily procedure. This erosion of identity increases emotional vulnerability. When the self feels fragile, any perceived threat, real or imagined, feels existential. Small conflicts carry enormous emotional weight. The inability to express or resolve those feelings leads to internal pressure. Self-regulation depends on meaning. Isolation strips meaning down to survival. Correctional officers observe behavioral shifts that reflect this struggle. CDCR documentation notes increases in repetitive behaviors, pacing, tapping, rigid exercise routines as emotional outlets. These actions provide temporary relief by restoring a sense of agency. Other inmates turn inward completely. In several verified case studies cited in prison mental health literature, individuals stopped requesting services, declined recreation, and minimized communication. This withdrawal is often mistaken for compliance. In reality, it can signal emotional shutdown. Chicago Crime Lab analyses indicate that inmates released from long-term restrictive housing often struggle with emotional modulation even in lower security settings. They may overreact to normal social friction or misinterpret neutral interactions as hostile. The emotional system has recalibrated to an environment of constant threat. One former inmate described feeling overwhelmed by ordinary conversation after release from isolation. Multiple voices, conflicting opinions, and spontaneous interaction triggered anxiety rather than comfort. The emotional tools required for social life had weakened. Inside the no-return unit, trust deteriorates as well. Trust requires predictability and shared experience. In isolation, interactions are brief, procedural, and asymmetrical. Staff hold total control over movement, access, and routine. Even when exercised professionally, that imbalance alters emotional dynamics. Some inmates begin to interpret neutrality as hostility. Others idealize rare moments of kindness, attaching excessive emotional significance to small gestures. Both responses reflect emotional deprivation. Officers are not immune. NFJ cited research on correctional staff assigned to high-control units shows elevated stress, emotional detachment, and burnout. To function, officers often suppress emotional engagement. Over time, this suppression can extend beyond the workplace. The emotional ecosystem of the unit becomes constrained on all sides. Importantly, emotional deterioration does not follow a single trajectory. Not all inmates become aggressive or visibly unstable. Many internalize distress, presenting as calm while experiencing significant internal strain. This makes the effects of isolation easy to underestimate. Haney emphasizes that the most concerning outcomes often emerge after prolonged isolation ends. Emotional dysregulation does not disappear upon release into general population or society. The brain adapts slowly, sometimes incompletely. The no-return unit teaches emotional lessons that are difficult to unlearn. That emotional expression is risky. That trust is unnecessary. That control matters more than connection. These lessons persist. As emotional regulation weakens, another capacity begins to erode, the ability to form and maintain social relationships at all. In the next chapter, we examine how isolation damages social functioning, empathy, and reintegration. Social atrophy and the failure of reintegration. Human beings do not lose social ability all at once. They lose it through disuse. By the time emotional regulation begins to weaken, social functioning has already started to deteriorate quietly. In the no-return unit, interaction is not eliminated entirely, but it is stripped of meaning. Communication becomes transactional, brief, and one-directional. According to research cited by the American Psychological Association and the National Institute of Justice, sustained deprivation of normal social interaction leads to social atrophy, the gradual loss of skills required to interpret tone, intention, and emotional nuance. In ordinary environments, social competence is constantly reinforced. People adjust behavior based on reactions, correct missteps, and repair misunderstandings. Inside long-term restrictive housing, none of these processes are available. When interaction is reduced to commands and compliance, language narrows. Humor disappears. Subtlety becomes unnecessary. Over time, the brain stops expecting social feedback and stops preparing for it. Inmates frequently describe conversations as exhausting rather than relieving when they occur. One verified nonfiction account from a state segregation review involved an individual who reported feeling overwhelmed by even brief exchanges, struggling to track multiple conversational cues at once. This reaction aligns with findings from Chicago Crime Lab analyses. Prolonged isolation reduces cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift attention, interpret ambiguity, and adapt behavior in real time. These capacities are essential for social life. As they weaken, misunderstanding increases. Minor social friction is perceived as hostility. Neutral expressions are interpreted as judgment. Without exposure to everyday variation in human behavior, the brain loses calibration. This has profound consequences for reintegration. John Irwin's sociological research emphasizes that prisons are social systems. Survival often depends on understanding informal norms, reading intentions, and managing interpersonal distance. Inmates returning from long-term isolation frequently lack these skills. Correctional records document elevated conflict rates among individuals transitioning directly from restrictive housing into general population units. These conflicts are not always violent, but they are persistent. The individual struggles to interpret boundaries. Others interpret this as provocation or disrespect. Tension escalates. Ironically, the no-return unit often produces the very instability it is designed to prevent. Empathy also erodes. Empathy is not a fixed trait. It is practiced. It develops through exposure to others' emotions, expressions, and reactions. In isolation, the opportunity to practice empathy disappears. APA-reviewed studies suggest that prolonged social deprivation can reduce empathic responsiveness, not because individuals become less moral, but because they receive no emotional input to respond to. Some inmates report feeling detached from others' experiences. News of family illness or loss arrives abstractly, without the shared rituals that help process grief. Emotional responses become muted or delayed. In some cases, empathy narrows rather than vanishes, directed only inward or toward imagined interactions. The internal world becomes more emotionally vivid than the external one. Correctional staff observe changes consistent with this pattern. CDCR documentation notes that inmates in long-term restrictive housing may appear indifferent to the consequences of their actions, not out of malice, but due to diminished emotional resonance. Social withdrawal becomes self-reinforcing. As social confidence declines, avoidance increases. The individual limits interaction to prevent mistakes. This further reduces practice, accelerating atrophy. When release from isolation finally occurs, whether into general population or the outside world, the contrast is extreme. Noise, movement, spontaneity, and unpredictability overwhelm the nervous system. Situations that others navigate automatically, waiting in line, interpreting sarcasm, resolving disagreement, require conscious effort. Former inmates described in nonfiction reintegration studies report feeling exposed and vulnerable in group settings. Some prefer isolation even after release, not because it is comfortable, but because it is familiar. This preference is often misunderstood. Choosing solitude after isolation is not necessarily a desire to withdraw. It can be an attempt to regain control over overstimulation. The brain has adapted to scarcity and now struggles with abundance. Family relationships suffer as well. Long-term separation under restrictive conditions disrupts emotional continuity. Families adapt to absence. Roles shift. When contact is limited to brief, monitored communication, emotional depth erodes. Upon reunion, both sides may feel disconnected. Expectations clash with reality. According to prison family studies referenced in corrections literature, this disconnection can lead to frustration, resentment, or withdrawal. The failure of reintegration is rarely sudden. It appears as misunderstanding, then isolation within groups, then conflict or withdrawal. For correctional systems, this creates a dilemma. Individuals struggling to reintegrate are often returned to restrictive housing, reinforcing the cycle. Craig Haney describes this as institutional entrapment, where psychological adaptation to isolation reduces the ability to function elsewhere, making continued isolation appear necessary. The no-return unit becomes a self-fulfilling classification. In the next chapter, we examine the long-term consequences of this cycle, what happens when isolation shapes behavior permanently, and how systems attempt, and often fail, to reverse its effects. Say continue when you're ready. Survival, resilience, and the human cost. Not every story ends in breakdown. Some inmates find strategies, mental exercises, rigid routines, small creative practices to preserve a sense of self. These acts do not erase isolation's effects, but they create a fragile continuity of identity. Psychology calls this adaptive resilience, the mind finding ways to maintain coherence under extreme constraint. Others do not survive intact. Emotional erosion, perceptual instability, and social atrophy can leave permanent scars. These are not myths. They're documented in NIJ, APA, and CDCR studies. Human minds shaped for connection are tested in ways few outside can imagine. Families bear a silent burden. Loved ones live in uncertainty, often adjusting life to the rhythms of absence. Staff, too, carry stress, emotional fatigue, and moral weight. Isolation shapes everyone who interacts with it. The no-return unit is more than a building or a policy. It is a psychological experiment imposed by circumstance, necessity, and fear. It asks a fundamental question. What is the cost of controlling human behavior at the expense of human connection? And when the doors finally open, if they ever do, the answer is written in the mind, in behavior, and in relationships forever. Understanding the no-return unit is not about sensationalism. It is about human psychology, survival, and the limits of confinement. If you want to explore more verified stories, psychological insights, and the hidden realities of incarceration across the world, subscribe to Life of Prisoners and join us in uncovering what happens when systems push the human mind to its edge.